So good evening, everyone. My topic is an architecture towards peace, decoding the symbiotic relationship of conflict and architecture, and advancing the agency of architecture towards positive peace and reconciliation. I begin my presentation with an image from the Architectural Forum edition of October 1945, which shows at the top the image of Hiroshima before and after the deadly bombing, and the image at the bottom of the Oak Ridge city, one among 10 cities that was designed to conceive the atomic bomb. The book Architecture of Peace opens with the quote, "To contribute to peace, one must know about conflict." Hence, my research begins with a number of questions that were not frequently asked with regards to this topic, that ranges from understanding the relationship of man and conflict, architecture and conflict, and architecture and peace. This proposal, thus, is a research cum design project that begins with the research regarding the topics of the foundational malevolent myths of architecture and its relation to conflict. The design will then be derived from understanding if a similar relation exists between architecture and peace, and understanding the agency of an architect in all of this, and where and how an architect can intervene. Thus, the following framework shows the tentative hierarchical framework of the thesis program. So question number 1, what is exactly up with man and conflict? The painting of Guernica by Picasso shows humanity at its worst. Are we humans thus naturally predisposed for violence? This belief has long been assumed as an excuse for war. But in 1989, the Seville Statement on Violence declared that it is scientifically incorrect to say that war or any other violent behavior is genetically programmed into our human nature. This motto was subsequently adopted by the United Nations. The pictures of Cologne, more than 50 years apart, show the capacity of humanity at its possible worst and hopeful best. 2. With respect to the topic of the seminar, has there been a global and cultural transfer of architecture during conflict and war? It can be found in the imperialistic imposition that was practiced in the Manila Master Plan by Daniel Burnham in the Philippines, and the Plan of New Delhi by Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker by the British. Another example is a very peculiar transfer that befell the prisoners of war. The image shows the green house that was designed by Simon Circus when he was detained in the Auschwitz camp. Ludovico Coroni, held as an Axis prisoner of war, is known to have worked on a pilgrimage church in the Himalayas. During Cold War times, even though there was a public aversion to the American capitalist style, as is evident in the painting by André Faugeron, a cultural transfer was still occurring in the background. Soviet architects looked to suburban American housing for the best solutions. Another ideological inversion was the strange phenomenon of the American skyscraper aesthetics in Moscow. The transatlantic movement of architect scholars under the Fulbright Scholarship is another case of cultural transfer. Question 3. Does architecture have a malevolent origin, and is this still replicated in modern times? Vitruvius's De Architectura is considered to be the first treatise in architecture. The collection of 10 books were presented to the Emperor Augustus more than 2 millennia ago, and this treatise has been taught as a foundational classical text that marked the formation of Western architecture as a discipline. But what is less known is the fact that his agenda in writing the book was largely shaped by a projection of world domination, as explained by Indra Kajis McEwen in her book, Writing the Body of Architecture. An example is the ancient town of Timgad in present-day Algeria, which follows the grid plan, a plan which is still used today, a plan that was derived from the military encampments. The modern branches of this architecture reveal an architecture of expansion that was practiced by architects under Nazi Germany, with their general plan OST that had an aim of Germanization of Eastern Europe. Similarly, during the Cold War era, Sovietization was practiced, where countries under the USSR were prescribed certain architectural and city planning models to follow. An architecture of domination is visible in the proposed world capital Germania that resembled Roman models. In the present century, we see classical architecture being weaponized by far-right groups in America with racist ideologies. Hence, this begs the question, is there a relationship between architecture and conflict? Architecture and the built environment are always among the first victims of conflict and war. Robert Bevan's The Destruction of Memory says that this is due to the extent to which a people's identity is linked to architecture. Such destruction not only shatters a nation's culture, but can be a deliberate attempt to eradicate the cultural memory of peoples and nations. The book also features a small section that shows destruction that occurred on multiple 9/11s. But there exists another relationship between architecture and conflict, that of an anomalous symbiotic liaison, in which one seems to feed on the other and thrive. We see an architecture due to conflict and an architecture for conflict. In an architecture due to conflict, we see an acceleration in architectural innovation, as noted by John Louis Quehen in his book Architecture in Uniform. We see the rise of architectural organizations and corporations in the examples of Albert Kahn Associates in the USA and the office of Herbert Rimpel in Germany, which employed close to 600 to 700 architects and draftsmen. Even the much revered Architects' Data by Ernst Newford was conceived during war times. Wartime housing on both sides of the Atlantic was a major architectural endeavor that resulted in new typologies, while war also provided an excuse for the rejustification of various ideological projects such as the Villa Reduce by Le Corbusier and the Broadacre City by Frank Lloyd Wright, who termed their cities as war-proof. The Vizotnes Nadia, or the tall buildings in the USSR, and the spate of television towers being built across the globe between the countries on either side of the Iron Curtain were important gauges in the Cold War competition. The second half of the last century also marked the rise of temporal architecture in the form of refugee camps, while this century has distinctly suffered military urbanism as a result of the city under siege and proactive security measures by governments, which will possibly, if not already, define the shape of the city to come. In architecture for conflict, though no particular thematic is evident in comparison to an architecture due to conflict, various examples of an architecture that has been built leading to conflict is observable, especially over this and the last century. The wall is the simplest three-dimensional element in architecture, but when something is modest can lead to segregation, as was apparent in Berlin and now in Belfast, West Bank, Nicosia, and Lima, to point out a few. The larger role of an architecture that easily carries the capacity to divide cannot be unseen. Housing and the innovation of typologies was a major byproduct of war, but the same was employed as an architectural element to conduct structural violence or a violence by the home to propagate the Zionist nation-building program. Architecture is also laid to blame for inciting violence. According to architect Wouter van Steenvoet, the French riots of 205 occurred in one specific type of urban setting without exception, the modernist high-rise neighborhoods, which originated from the ideas of the Villa Reduce. The case of homes in Syria shows a differentiation by architecture, which was propagated by the French policies of segregating the population based on their religion and the brutalist style of construction that followed. Even though this unnatural but fathomable liaison mentioned above was studied in order to understand the relationship between architecture and conflict, the objective has been primarily for the polar opposite, to understand whether there exists an architecture of peace. In World War II, intellectuals, including architects, assembled at the World Congress of Intellectuals in Defense of Peace in Wrocław, Poland, to deliberate the future of the world, but the program ended on a disappointing note due to its pro-Soviet stance. However, along with the exhibition of the regained lands, it had a significant effect on the rebuilding process in war-torn Poland. Mark Schunderbeek and Malkitz Shoshin claim that the emergence of new spaces of conflict have produced a diversified field of thinking and action in architecture that has shown a remarkable adequacy in addressing spaces of conflict. Specific entities that have a fervent focus on architecture and peace include Architecture Sans Frontières, an international body, Architecture Without Frontiers that focuses on Australia and the Asia-Pacific region, Architecture for Humanity that published 2 parts of the book Design If You Give a Damn, which recounts architectural projects, including theirs, around the world that addresses humanitarian crisis. Architecture of Peace is an international research and action project based out of Amsterdam and Berlin that deals with interventions at all scales of architectural capacity. 2 editions of the volume magazine have been dedicated to their work. Design and Peace was a colloquium organized by the Alvar Aalto Foundation to have a collective examination on the topics of conflict and peace, peace in society, and spatial peace. Architecture of Democracy was a joint online public discussion between the architectural departments of Harvard and MIT on the character of architecture to represent peace and democracy. In the School of Taught Architecture, Political Architecture offered by KADK, and the Master's degree in International Cooperation offered by the UIC School of Architecture prepares architects to rebuild communities affected by the impact of military conflicts in both developed and developing countries. So what can an architect do in all of this? What is the agency of an architect? We see Albert Speer claiming his architectural fixation on production blurred all.
You have 3 minutes left, okay?
Yes, Professor. Blurred all considerations and feelings of humanity. During World War II, architects were asked to systematically list the objects not to target for aerial bombardment, which resulted in the preservation of churches and palaces, but caused a detriment to the urban fabric. The French riots of 205 have been exclusively blamed on the modernist ideology of the villa reduce. If architects and/or the built environments have the capacity to cultivate violence and discord, can it not be wielded to harvest peace too? I'd be the first to acknowledge that the capacity of an architect is certainly not enough to attain peace, positive or otherwise. But at the same time, architecture enjoys a certain privilege over other forms of representation, the privilege of being able to recast space, mold material, and create a realm. Because it could be through this realm that open dialogue is encouraged, tenets are exchanged, harmonious values are advocated, and goodwill is endorsed. Winston Churchill once famously said, "We shape our buildings, thereafter our buildings shape us." On to the final question of the research as to how and where an architect can intervene. I've been able to identify 3 zones of conflict, one of post-conflict, of ongoing conflict, and what I feel to be the most important in this century, the zones of potential conflict. Architectural literature and on-site programs are available in post-conflict zones, but is significantly lacking in the other 2 zones. Hence, with an agenda of prevention as the basis of this design proposal, I've structured my thesis in a way that depends on post-conflict for research, but design intervention in the other 2 zones. Possible design proposals could include redesign of war remnants or interventions at borders or monumental architecture, or a mix of all 3, which will be decided by the selection of the site of intervention. There might hopefully be other options as my research further develops. A few examples of what the design proposal could look like. To the questions raised in this research and upon further study, I would like to understand the true extent of the capacity of an architect and architecture in a world at conflict and how we can positively affect it. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect timing. Perfect timing. And very interesting presentation. By the way, it was funny because you showed a picture of a building, and it's the building where I am in this moment, and it's not the Brandenburger Tor. So, Domenico first, then Brian, then Alberto.
It's really complicated. It's not easy to deal with this specific problem of the relationship between architecture and conflict. I would say that architecture is in the middle of conflict. Was always in the middle of conflict. Starting from the Roman settlement, right, and such as the military, settlement as a kind of prototype of the city till nowadays, right? So the problem is how can architecture deal, or maybe cope with the problem considering in the middle of the conflict as a kind of, I would say, if we can still recognize a kind of iconological value in the architecture in itself. So we should discover this idea of the iconological value. That is not iconographical value, that is the figure, the appearances of the architecture, but the meaning of, you know, the structure of the space, how, you know, we can recognize this value in the architecture. So in the history, the ideological, you know, different maybe position from left to right and so on, we're dealing with the problem of the iconological value of the architecture itself as a kind of items in you know, considering the structure of the different settlement, how they can provide for developing, you know, the different part of the ideologies. So what we can do today in considering the rule of architecture in the middle of the conflict, that is something that is really interesting for me. So we should deal with the problem not only of the function, not only, but I would say that the main problem is to rediscover the iconological value of the structure, the space in architecture. And this is really important. I would say the symbolic appearances of the architecture. This is one of the aspects that you should consider, and maybe could be, you know, something that is, you know, considered even in. I was working in my PhD thesis considering 3 different revolution state: the American Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, the French Revolution, and how the architecture were dealing in the middle of the revolution with the architects such as Ledoux and Boulez, such as Benjamin Latrobe or Thomas Jefferson in USA, or maybe, I don't know, Melnikov or Leonidov in the, you know, Russian Soviet architecture. So this is I could consider, you know, the problem of this symbolic aspect of the architecture that those architects were dealing with. So starting from the first, you know, suggestion that Brian was telling us today, let's try and start with some precedents that can help us how some great architects were dealing in the problem, in the middle of the problem, in the conflict, and how can they discover some aspect of the architecture itself that could be an idea for your topic, maybe. But it's really complex. It's a huge, you know, problem that you are considering. But thank you very much.
Brian.
Yeah, I thought it was a great presentation, and I guess my questions would be one of strategic approach, like what is your strategy? Because you laid out a framework relationship between conflict and peace, and I think you started to get that towards the end, but I do think that inevitably you're going to be proposing something that's reactive to a situation, right? So it's not an architecture of peace in isolation. It's how to, in a certain way, react to the potential of conflict to create something, right? And I think that's what Domenico was talking about in terms of those examples that you mentioned from your PhD thesis, which were in a particular context, how do you react to a situation of conflict? In order to move it towards something more positive, right? So I think inevitably it's a strategic thing, not something that's conceived in isolation, because we could talk about what is an architecture of peace in a very idealistic sort of way, but I think yours is dialectically linked to the idea of conflict. So it's a question of strategy against or with conflict. How does one create something positive? So that implies a kind of a necessary strategy that recognizes the contribution of architecture to conflict and attempts to kind of be a reparative or restorative thing. And so I think the other thing or suggestion maybe, because your project is so big and so ambitious in a certain way, I think finding something to make it more concrete, a particular context situation, because everything becomes much more specific the second that you do this. And probably you have some ideas in mind, but I think that's going to be an important decision that you make. Like, where is the context that I'm going to enter into to kind of respond to these questions? Where is there a current conflict or potential of conflict? How could our architecture kind of immediately begin to respond? That'll be another set of decisions that you'll probably need to make fairly quickly, because I don't think you're going to get to it by the grand narrative or the master narrative. I think you need a very specific situation to then react to, because again, I think it's a reactive to a situation, not something that's conceived in isolation.
And Alberto.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you very much, Jose, for this presentation. I found it extremely interesting, even if I'm not a specialist of this topic, but I found very fascinating the research itself, and my comments are in line with those by Brian, because I think that the research that you are proposing is quite huge. Even if in your scheme, I did some screenshot about your slide, but I think that the structure that you propose is quite clear. But I think that could be greater if you specify better the geographies that you take into account and the time that you take into account during this first part of the research, because when you have to arrive to the last part, that in my opinion is extremely fascinating, and you put you identify some categories such as, for example, the post-war remains, etc. I think it has to be clear for you what the geographies are you studying and what is the objective also of the design that you have to do. I think that for certain aspects, this research touches some topics and is in line with the first research that we saw today, because in fact it is also a geography of conflict, but it was very, very focused on a specific place. I think that in your case you have to focus much better the places and times, because you can also do this research as an historical research. It could be extremely interesting, in my opinion, focusing on some specific case studies. Or nowadays, you can switch to a research such as the one that we saw today in a place, in a geography that has got some criticities in this term. It's extremely challenging, this topic. So thank you very much for. It's a brilliant idea, this kind of research.
Thank you.
I was thinking Jose reacts, and then
yes,
is it okay, or you want to add something now, Gaia?
Well, before he reacts, maybe it's helpful to understand again frame, because I think it can help. I followed Jose in this first part of research, and we were impressed since the beginning by the aim that he had, and he was interested in exploring this field, and the idea was really to survey, to create a recognition of sources. I am impressed by the sophisticated selection of cases that he was able to put together. But the idea was to have a theoretical background for a project, for a design proposal. But looking at this phase of the research, and I think the three comments will be crucial in taking a direction and make a decision today. If these go into a historical or critical theoretical thesis, because I think that can cross diverse moments, but with a different type of deepening, because now for you it was the tentative to create a theoretical framework for your project. It has to be decided, I think, in the next weeks. And I think the 3 comments and remarks and the discussion will help a lot in order to understand, because I have to say, impressed by the curiosity and the attention to explore the field from very diverse perspective and to put together a bibliography that I found really sophisticated, but now has to take a clear direction, I think.
Jose.
Just
yes, so thank you all for your comments.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you all for your comments, Professor Domenico, Professor Brian, Professor Alberto, and Professor Gaia. Yes, I know that my next step is in deciding a particular place, but I wanted to do this amount of research so that I would not have to come back to this once I'd already decided on my place, and hence that is the reason why I've invested so much time on trying to understand what or how architecture has been impacted due to conflict. Because if you look at my presentation, the vast majority of it belongs to architecture and conflict, while architecture and peace is very less. And I think that is a problem that as an architectural community we have to deal with, and hence the reason for all that talk. But then yes, I completely understand. I'll be narrowing it down on a particular place, a particular geography, so they can understand the context and apply the agency of an architect in that particular place. Yeah.
Helen, you want to add something? Microphone.
Yes. Now, let me say that I'm really impressed by your work, because I remember perfectly when we had the very first discussions, when you had only to present a trace for a research. It was 1 page, a kind of only conceptual framework. And even with the title of Architecture and Peace, we say, oh goodness, it is too ambitious, it is too big to say. Architecture and I don't know, very very generic. But you develop a very precise narration, and this I was really impressed by that. Now, effectively, I totally agree with what was proposed by Brian McLaren. The fact is important to choose, because they are clearly very different conflicts. It's very different if you take a conflict where it is for a war for colonization or for invasion, and the power is developing their own architecture of power. It's very different when you have an ethnical or religious conflict. And my proposal will be that eventually to think more that architecture and peace, to think about the concept of inclusion, to be inclusive. And one example is the fact that there have been some competitions, especially in Europe, about religious conflict, for developing an idea of a space for interreligious practice. And there's been in different cities, there was even student competition, so that architecture itself can represent an idea of inclusion. And this can be even reflected historically by the fact, for example, the very famous example in one building, it is the Mezquita of Cordoba in Spain, because it was a mosque. And after this was transformed, it was the reconquest of Catholic Church, but the Catholic power didn't demolish the mosque, but put in the middle of the mosque a cathedral, even it's a signal of power. But in the same time, you could say an architecture of inclusion, because you maintain the memory of the mosque, even if it is now to the Catholic Church, so that you can reflect more, starting from a story or some case study of buildings who could represent this idea of inclusion. Even they were a sign of power, but after in the time were transformed even of the possibility of inclusion. And there will be a connection with the discourse of Domenico, who said about the iconologic value of architecture.
symbolic.
And symbolic, yeah.
And one thing is just to remind that the aim of this thematic research seminar is to undertake research that provides the grounding for the following steps, and Domenico will agree on this, so that next steps will be informed. Whatever will be the direction of the thesis, there will be, let's say, there will be ammunitions for supporting since we are talking about war, peace and war, so I thought the metaphor would work well.
Excuse me, let's